Dear young adults, Om Sairam and welcome to the March workshop for the Sathya Sai Young Adult Talent Development Program 2018. Before we kickstart today's workshop, let us pray to our beloved Bhagavan for his blessings to ensure that the session runs smoothly. Om. 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 Dear Bhagavan, we pray to you to seek your guidance, to deepen our understanding and to broaden our thinking. Swami, with your divine blessings, may the skills that we develop from this workshop be used to aid us all in our daily lives. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Today's session will be facilitated by Brother Satheeshan Siva from the United States. Brother Satheeshan is the current Zone 1 Young Adults Coordinator, and he is also the president of the Sathya Sai Center in Manhattan. He has completed his Bachelor of Science in Computer Science and is currently working in consulting leading digital transformation engagements. Brother Satheeshan, the floor is all yours.
Hi Ram, thank you brother for that very loving introduction. My loving salutations at the lotus feet of our dear beloved Bhagavan Sri Sathya Sai Baba. Dear brothers and sisters from all over the globe, loving Sai Ram to each and every one of you. It was so wonderful to hear from all of you in the chat box before we started and to see the truly global Sai family that we have on here. I am honored to present to you the next entry in this very blessed Young Adult Talent Development Workshop Series. This is entry number 9. Today, we will take you back to the source and share with you some tools, techniques, and strategies for how you can effectively give and receive feedback. So a little bit about me and my experience on the topic of feedback. As brother so introduced, I work in an industry where giving and receiving feedback is truly critical to our organizational success. Working in consulting, what we essentially have to offer is our skills, our insights, and our foresight, and what that means is really our people. So as an industry, the ongoing development of our product is really to the ongoing development of our people. And this is achieved through 2 mechanisms, feedback and training. And so feedback is very much a huge part of this. And to do this, we have to create an environment where we acknowledge that everyone has development areas, and so it's okay to accept that we're all learning and growing, that this process is ongoing and expected, and feedback is a big part of this. We're going to explore this further during the course of today's session. I'd actually like to share one example of how feedback has benefited me from such an environment and as such a tool. So there's many examples. I just chose one at random. I remember one of my earlier development points in my career was focused on the fact that I was so focused on accuracy when it came to an answer or discussion, particularly in meetings. And for anyone that's done the DISC profile that we had at the World Youth Festival, one of the booths there had a DISC profile, you could say that's a strong C sort of attribute. So when it came to brainstorming meetings, I'd often hold back and I wouldn't share because I wanted to make sure I had the right answers before I went in, which is counterintuitive to a brainstorming meeting. And I had mentors, and one of my mentors actually gave me a feedback session, and in that he said, well, you know, you have to feel empowered and okay to be wrong, that in this type of exploratory environment and session where we're just exchanging ideas openly, you have to be okay with throwing something and maybe it doesn't stick to the wall. And that actually made a huge difference to me because I didn't realize at the time that by holding back and not sharing my ideas, I wasn't helping what the team was trying to achieve in those meetings. And so you can kind of see in the picture there that even though at the time I thought I was contributing in that environment, looking back, I might not have been. But years later, that still has had an effect on me where now I feel quite empowered and maybe I have to hold back in brainstorming session because that's what the value is at, and I'm okay to be wrong, even though I wasn't. So it's just an example of how feedback can grow. And obviously, there's times to be more forthright in putting forward ideas, and times when you do have to listen. And listening is a big part as well, which we're going to cover. It's very important to practice that active listening skill as a feedback element. But as you learned today, the ability to use the feedback effectively is not just a skill that's applicable to the workplace. In fact, you're already using it, whether you realize it or you don't. It's really a skill that's applicable to all areas of our lives. And this, of course, includes our spiritual practices and our spiritual growth. And that, of course, includes our work as Sathya young adult devotees and young adult leaders. So with that, here is our agenda for today. We're going to start off by diving into the topic of exactly what feedback is. Then we'll be moving into the value of using feedback. Then we will look at how we can effectively both give and receive feedback. And we'll start to draw to a close on ways we can practice this new skill that you've gained at the end of this workshop, followed by some brief Q&A if time permits. So ready, set, go. We're about to get into this journey. All right, so we start at step 1, which is defining our terms. So what exactly is this feedback thing about anyway? And as we start to explore that topic, I want to share this beautiful quote from Ajira Swami. And it goes like this: education should build character. It's truth and truth alone. That is one's real friend, relative. And what Swami is reminding us here is that anytime we learn something, ultimately, real learning is about building character. And so let's keep that in mind as we're defining terms and learning that ultimately what we want to do is build our character. And as you'll see, feedback is ultimately about peeling back layers of truth, understanding each other's truths and perspectives so we can in turn grow and develop. And in doing so, we can uncover the ultimate truth, that truth which is the source of all. Okay, so as young adults living in 2018, we may or may not realize it, but we in fact live in a world that is ever filled with the giving and receiving of this thing called feedback. You may view it both as a term and a skill. Like any term, we may each start this session with slightly different definition of what it actually represents. And like any skill, the giving and receiving of feedback effectively is something that can be learned and developed with practice. So to dive into today's topic, let's get on the same page and first define this term. And we start at none other than the Oxford Dictionary, which is considered to be one of the gold standards of the English language. And the Oxford Dictionary defines feedback as information about reactions to a product, a person's performance of a task, etc., which is used as a basis for improvement. And you can see how this definition touches upon many aspects of a person's life, many realms and globes of our lives: work, our school, our spiritual disciplines, our family, etc. But this is a good start. I think we can make this just a little bit clearer for all of us here today. Feedback, simply put, is anything that allows us to learn about ourselves from others. Typically, this is about how we are progressing towards our goals, or how we are progressing in terms of others' expectations of us. We can get it either formally or we can get it informally. And if it's effective and it's relevant, it is truly a powerful tool for our personal development. And so, as I mentioned before, we are bombarded with feedback each and every day. So, with that, I have a question for each of you. I would like to invite you to answer this question by typing your responses in the chat window in the bottom right-hand corner of your screens. Please make sure you have send to everyone selected so we can all see your answers. And the question is, based on this definition of feedback, which is, simply put, feedback is anything that allows us to learn about ourselves from others, what are some everyday examples you can think about from various parts of your life of giving, receiving feedback? So go ahead and please share your answers in the bottom right-hand corner chat window. Shalu shares the hospitality industry. Very nice. There's a lot of feedback there, definitely. Brother Pajin and Bro Shabu say, if you are doing a new activity, you should ask for feedback from people who are well versed with activity. Meenakshi says, in social networks, Facebook, we often give feedback. We like or comment or post. Yeah, that's very true. Absolutely. Kartika, teachers shouldn't feedback. Yeah, very important. That's a very formal mechanism for getting feedback. Absolutely. Dulaksha also says feedback on university assignments for improvements. Yeah, definitely. In the educational system, our growth is through feedback, through correction. Absolutely. Raksha says daily feedback from her husband. So something to be grateful for. Her husband is helping her to grow. Pratisha says 360 feedback from work. Yeah, it's a very powerful mechanism now where we talk about 360, not just from the supervisor to report, but we're looking at a 360 view of feedback, which is very popular these days. Darshana, feedback happens all the time at almost every point in our lives. Sometimes we even give ourselves feedback without realizing. Yep. Nithya, feedback from mother to child, peer-to-peer, questionnaires, assessments, and Ravi, team meetings, discussions, feedbacks on unit activities. These are all great examples, and you're all right. Feedback is around us, and it's accelerating, particularly with things like social networks. So you touched upon a lot of these, but these are just a small set of examples just to show how feedback immerses our modern lives. We give and receive feedback all the time. Performance reviews, social media, likes, loves, comments, people's reactions when a baby smiles just for a mother, that's feedback. Academic results we talked about. A job offer, that's feedback on your performance in the interview. Bhajan lead follow levels. If the congregation is very involved in the follow, then that is some feedback about the way the bhajan is being conducted. Why project participation? Say you're running a project and you get really great participation. That's feedback in the ability to get the word out and to engage young adults in an activity that they see is something that they want to participate in and they want to be a part of, and allows them to channel their spiritual sadhana. So that's just some examples, but you guys got it from the beginning. There's feedback all around. So now looking at it further, there are in fact two types of feedback that you're going to be encountering for your personal growth. There's positive feedback and there's corrective feedback. And both of these are used to let participants know how they're doing compared to their goals or the expectations others may have of them. And when we think about feedback, we may naturally think of the corrective type more, but it's just as important that we look at the positive feedback because our personal growth comes from both. And we're going to be looking at both types during the course of this workshop. Starting with positive feedback, well, this is really used to encourage or foster or maintain the recipient's positive behavior, or what's perceived as positive behavior. It's a really great tool to use to let people know that they have met or exceeded their goals or the expectations that others had, and it's great to inspire the recipients to strive for even higher levels, and this is based on their past successes. This is usually the easier one for us to both give and receive. It's often the one that gives us that warm and fuzzy feeling. The corrective one, on the other hand, has a different purpose, and it should firstly be approached with a constructive and motivational spirit. Corrective feedback, is used to guide the recipients in changing actions so they can meet their goals and meet expectations better. And when it's used effectively, this type of feedback can improve behavior and allow individuals to really learn and change and improve. So it's quite powerful. Ultimately, it's really used in situations where people may be failing to adequately meet their goals or expectations. And this is usually the more difficult one for us to both give and receive. But both types are just as important for our growth. Okay, so we've covered some of the basic feedback theory and definitions. And you may be thinking, well, that sounds interesting. And I'm sure there's a lot of thought and research behind it. But why does this matter to me? Well, hold on, because the answer to that is coming up in the next section. And going to the section, here is a wonderful quote from Ajira Swami where he says, life is loving, listening, lifting, learning, living. These 5 L's are a really beautiful lesson from Swami. And when used effectively with the right intentions, this tool of feedback is really a way of practicing all 5 L's. And as we go to the next few sections, see if you can identify how that is. So a small story to illustrate the power of feedback. So once upon a time, there was a little lion cub who was left abandoned in the forest, and he was there in the forest alone and scared and shivering. It so happened that day that a flock of sheep were passing by, and one of those sheep noticed this little lion cub, and saddened, she took the little lion cub in and took care of him that day. The days became weeks, and as time went on, he began to think of himself as a sheep, and acted like one as well. Then one day down the line, when the flock of sheep with the lion cub who thought he was a sheep were gathered together and grazing, this large lion came out of the forest and roared very, very loudly. The sheep heard this and they scrambled. They hid, everyone, including the lion cub. The big lion that came out of the forest saw this and was utterly confused. He was like, what is going on? So he walked up to the little lion cub in the spot that he saw him go hide, and he was like, what are you doing? And the little cub, trembling in fear, just begged the lion, please don't eat me. Big lion was surprised, and he responded, I'm not going to eat you. You and I are the same. The cub just kind of went along with it, and he was like, okay, fine, whatever you say, just please don't eat me. So the big lion was even more perplexed, and he shook his head and said, okay, I promise I'm not going to let any harm happen to you. I'm not going to eat you. I'm going to protect you, but I really have to show you who you are. Come with me. So the little cub nervously tagged along and followed him, where he led him to this large, still lake where the reflection was strong. And he walked up to the reflection and told the cub, come up and look at your reflection in the water. They both walked up to the water and stood and looked down on the reflections. The big lion said, see, you are like me. Little cub was just surprised and said, whoa, yes, I am like you. I'm not like the other sheep. I'm one of you. The big lion said, yes, you are a lion. You are not a sheep. Now roar like me. And then he roared. The cub then eventually let out a roar as well, after trying a few times. And then he was jumping with joy and thankful to the big lion. The big lion just told him, don't thank me. I didn't do anything. I didn't turn you from a sheep into a lion. I only showed you who you already are. He gave him feedback, and the lion grew. Now you could look at it and say, was it positive feedback or was it the constructive type, the corrective type? And so I'll let you decide for yourself which one that was. Ultimately, Swami is the gold standard when it comes to everything, including feedback. His life is an example of how an ideal human being should live. He gave us countless examples of every aspect of life, including on how to use this tool of feedback. Swami ultimately wanted all of his devotees to know real happiness, real bliss, real truth, real love. Through his interactions with devotees, he would lovingly either give them feedback on their meeting his expectations on their path to achieving this, and he used both positive and corrective feedback techniques. Swami would even listen carefully and allow for others to speak when they were in a position to give feedback on matters, demonstrating effective listening skills and effective ability to process and to walk people through the feedback process. So it's amazing that even on the topic of feedback, Swami truly lived by his message of my life is my message. He was and is a true master. So I have another question for you again, which I'd like to invite you to go to the bottom right-hand corner and type your answers to. So can you think of any examples you've heard of or you know when Swami has used the tool of feedback? And you can just summarize in a couple of sentences. Does that be a big the long story version? But if you think of any, we'd love to hear. Okay, so I see some answers coming too. So Brother Prajeet and Brother Subu say Vedam chanting. Sai Girda says Swami would come back after his divine discourse and ask how the discourse was. So what an amazing example of Swami actively looking for feedback and receiving feedback. Meenakshi says when blissful bhajans are played inside Kulwant Hall, Swami making the gesture is a sort of feedback. Oh, yeah, absolutely. In 2007, Shalu says when the World Youth Conference was on, he gave us feedback on the bag packs we all got. He checked if the pen was working by scribing on the back of the notebook. Absolutely. Darshana says when Swami sits in for rehearsals before performances in party and helps performances improve, even if it's a tiny little detail. Again, feedback. That's wonderful how we can think of so many examples of Swami showing how we should be when we come to giving feedback and even receiving feedback, him asking how discourse as well. I think the best feedback Swami always provided and provides us with is taking us closer to who we are, to the question, who am I? So he provides us the tools of this inner feedback from the master within. It's very nice to Raksha. Ravi says there have been a lot of discourses he gave us shared. They were some kind of feedback. Yeah. Shalu, we've seen photos of Swami asking students, have you eaten? Yeah. Absolutely. So Swami is the gold standard again, and he is the master. So we just have to look to him, and he's given so many examples and demonstrating just how important it is to both give and to look for feedback as well, to make sure that we are constantly improving and constantly learning from others around us. Okay, so a couple more answers. Bhuvanaswari says, Swami makes eye contact with those who have questions, acknowledging that he knows. Sagirada, he once looked at the extravagant makeup on Krishna and said, if you look like this, no gopi will ever come near Krishna in a humorous tone. Anastasia Swami smiled and his touch. Sagirada, he got the blue color corrected to his requirement, finally. Okay, very nice. Oh, for the Krishna, sorry, very nice. So great examples. All right, so let's now start to dive deeper into tools that you have available for receiving and giving feedback effectively. And we begin this section with another beautiful quote from our dearest Swami. And here he says, you are three people. You are the one you think you are, the body. You are the one others think you are, the mind. And you are the one you really are, which is divine. And this is a very beautiful quote. And when I read this, it really reminded me of this topic. In fact, this topic reminded me of this quote. And the reason is, as we mentioned at the start, feedback can be looked at as a way to peel back these layers of truth and get to the real truth from exchanging ideas and seeing the other perspective that people may have. And in many ways, this is a way of bridging the gap between the one you think you are and the one others think you are. And by doing so, moving towards a greater truth, because it starts to help us to transcend both of these perspectives. And at the end, there's only really the one we really are. And by being able to shift and see that these are different perspectives and aspects that allow us to grow, ultimately it's about us moving back to this source and moving back to who we really are, which is divinity. And in our spiritual path, this also applies. If you think about the guru system that it was followed traditionally in nations such as India, where there was that student guru, this learning system, and in there it was the teacher passing on lessons and also giving that feedback. So it was a very beautiful quote that I think is very relevant to this section. So on receiving feedback, I'll begin by clarifying that receiving feedback doesn't mean you always have to take the feedback. What I mean by effectively receiving feedback is that you can engage in the conversation skillfully, and you can make thoughtful choices about whether and how to use the information and what you're learning. And it's really, really important that you're able to manage emotional triggers, which I'll talk about, so that you can take in what the other person is telling, and you're able to see yourself in new ways. And it can also be about setting boundaries and saying no. Some of the benefits about this process of receiving feedback are the relationships we have with individuals in our lives can become richer. Our self-esteem can grow. We can grow and learn and overcome blind spots that we aren't aware of. And interestingly, when we get good at receiving feedback, it also makes the tougher conversations that we have easier. So in all areas of your life, in all the different spheres, treating feedback as something like you actively seek, it can have huge benefits. For example, in the workplace arena, what's called as feedback-seeking behavior in research literature, well, this has been linked to higher job satisfaction, greater creativity on the job, faster adaptation in a new organization or role, and lower organizational turnover. And amazingly, seeking out the corrective type of feedback is also associated with higher performance ratings. So making this a habit and part of something you actively pursue has been linked through research to have many benefits. So we're going to start off when it comes to receiving feedback. So we're looking first at how do we receive feedback before we go into how do we give feedback, because we want to understand that first perspective so we become more effective at the second perspective. So getting positive feedback. This, well, can be the easier one of the two. And it could, though, sometimes feel a little bit awkward when we get it. But relatively speaking, we are pretty much quite fine with this type of feedback, the positive feedback, when we're talking about in comparison to the corrective one. This is generally speaking. Now, we may feel a little bit awkward or uneasy getting this, and that's normal. The reason is because we're not sure if the feedback that we're getting is genuine or we fear we haven't earned it. And the thing to keep in mind is when you find out that things are going well and you're on a path to success, achieving the goals, and you're getting feedback of meeting expectations, it is a good achievement. It is a good satisfactory feeling. So if you've ever been in that situation where you've got positive feedback and you're not quite sure how to handle it, well, here's a 4-step process to effectively handle those situations. If you ever get awkward about getting sincere praise, and remember that's sincere praise you're getting, that someone is coming over and taking their time to give you. So you should begin by looking at it from that perspective. So first of all, accept the feedback given to you. Don't downplay it, even if this may be a natural reaction, but embrace it. So over time, you'll learn to overcome that natural downplaying reaction. Embrace it. Someone came over to give you something positive. It's a present, so you want to accept it. Someone thinks that things you're doing are great. That's awesome. The second step is to thank them sincerely. After all, they did go out of their way to acknowledge something positive about you or your behavior. Thirdly, evaluate what the feedback means, and if it is constructive, then evaluate what you can take away from it. And if possible, then discuss steps on how you can reinforce or enhance the behavior or the attribute if you have deemed it to be beneficial. If you're not able to discuss it with that person, at least try to reflect on this on your own. So here's a 4-step process of how we can effectively receive positive feedback. Now let's think of an example. So this one may resonate with our group here. So say you're leading a bhajan at your center, a devotional song at your center, and you practice all week to lead it, and you got to the center and you led it. And afterwards, people came up to you and they said, wow, when you led that song, we all felt so uplifted and energetic because of the way that you led it. So in that situation, think about how you could effectively apply this type of methodology to that. Okay, so receiving corrective feedback is a little bit tougher. It's tougher to hear even if it's true or helpful. And we'll talk about why. You'll find that it actually can invoke the fight or flight response in our brains. This is a fight or flight mechanism that's hardwired into the very, very primitive part of the brain. And this fight or flight mechanism, it'll manifest through common responses that you'll encounter when it comes to getting corrective feedback. Now, on the screen, you can see that I put up an image showcasing physical indications of going into fight or flight mode. Just remember that it's completely natural to tense up at the thought of someone giving us corrective feedback. Hey, the thought that we haven't performed or made a mistake, or it's not supposed to be a fun idea to entertain, but understanding this process and understanding what's happening will allow you to recognize when it happens. And by doing so, you can in turn learn to address it and control those reactions, so you can get to getting powerful conversations where you can effectively receive feedback and not go to the fight or flight response, but learn to be a bit more in the objective space. So let's look at the common responses that you may get when you're in a situation where you have to get corrective feedback. And as we go through this list, make note of if you have ever remembered experiencing this, and as you become aware of this, this will be the first step to be able to manage those responses. And again, these are natural responses that come from the fight or flight patterns that are built into the human brain. The common responses you'll see are rejecting the feedback. So this is when we receive feedback that provokes insecurities or might make us feel threatened. We may get into a defensive position and go on the offensive even. So even if we're wrong, we might not admit a mistake, we might reject the criticism, point out the other person's mistakes, or some other form of attack. But that's the rejecting the feedback manifestation of the fight or flight response. The next one we'll talk about is the admitting, explaining. And this is when we might feel guilty for making a mistake, or we might feel as though we're being judged negatively, or we may want to explain that, hey, what happened to cause the mistake, or point out the mistake is common. Admitting our mistakes is good, and it's great to recognize that so we can grow. But in this case, what happens is it's a fight or flight response acting, and we excessively defend our actions. And the third type that you'll see in the manifestation is agreeing but maybe feeling wronged. And in these situations, we might not be able to disagree, and we might not be able to take ownership, but we don't really necessarily accept it, and we aren't able to say or think what we really feel in those situations. We might walk away feeling even wronged, even though we said we agree, but really we didn't. And in this sort of mindset, what will happen is really the mind shuts down and retreats. And these are all those fight or flight responses manifesting when it comes to the corrective feedback. Now, what we want to get to, that versus, is receiving it effectively. This is where we can gauge the information that the other person has given in a positive and constructive way. And if we're able to react to the feedback in a positive, constructive manner, we'll find that there's ways to benefit from it, find out what caused the mistake, and learn to do better in the future. And even if we disagree with the feedback, when we're in this state of receiving feedback effectively, we're in a much better position to explain our opinion. So this is just a view of the psychology, and as we went through, make note of if you've ever experienced any of these, and that's going to be great as we go into the next few areas. So knowing that the psychology of how this works, as I mentioned, the first step is really learning to manage our reactions when we're getting this creative feedback. And so here's a checklist. So know your triggers. So what are the triggers? The triggers are the truth, relationship, identity triggers. So truth triggers are set off when we feel something about the substance of the feedback is wrong. It's not helpful. It's not true. We just don't necessarily agree with the truth of it. So that's the first trigger that you want to watch yourself to see if that's triggering a fight or flight kind of response. Second one might be a relationship trigger. What does this mean? It's about how we relate with the person who's giving it. So how we interpret the feedback can also be based on how we view the individual. For example, if they're in a position of authority or our past interactions with them, their credibility on a topic, things we might have done to help them in the past. What this is really seeing is, whereas the true trigger is really saying the feedback is wrong, it's unfair, it's unhelpful, the relationship trigger is, I can't hear this from you. And the third type of trigger is the identity one. So this is really when it's about us. It's not that we question whether it's true or not. It's not about the way we relate with the people. This is all about us. This is when we get something that might question how we view ourselves. We feel unbalanced, or we might feel ashamed. And what this feedback is essentially saying, what this trigger, is essentially saying is, what I'm hearing can feel threatening and it can make me feel off balance. So the next one that we're talking about is just make sure that you remind yourself what you're hearing. It's not about you. It's about some work or some action that can be improved for future results. When it comes to constructive feedback, just remind yourself, hey, it's not about me. It's about something, some work, some action, and it's all about improvement for better results. Ask yourself questions to keep things in perspective. Remind yourself to listen, engage in constructive behavior, and be in control of the situation. React appropriately. So here is a four-step process, I say, that you can use when you're in a situation where you're getting corrective feedback. And remember to use your coping skills and monitor your emotional state throughout this interaction. This process allows you to turn the exchange into a dialogue. So the first one is paraphrase. So here, remain calm, focused when you're paraphrasing. Simply reflect on what you hear and understand back to the person in a respectful way without repeating exactly what the person says, and that's key. Play it back in your own words. Don't just say what they said exactly. Then listen. Number two, by staying silent and listening carefully, you enable others to express their thoughts freely and fully. And although it's important not to offer information at this point, you still need to convey warmth and support. So make sure you don't withdraw and use open body language, appropriate eye contact, nodding, short prompting gestures to encourage the person to continue. You can alternate between listening and paraphrasing until you're sure you understand what your conversational partner is trying to get across to you. And you can even ask clarifying questions in this stage so you hear what the other person is saying correctly. And sometimes you may hear comments in this listening stage that you strongly disagree with, and if so, you can respond with something like, that's interesting, and appropriately discuss it later in the fourth step, negotiation. Make sure in step two you understand the problem and what you may have done wrong. Step three, acknowledge. Once you've understood what's been said, you need to acknowledge the person's feelings, opinions, perceptions of the person giving the feedback. You also need to acknowledge the importance of the situation if it's appropriate. Acknowledging is just really a way of showing respect and recognition. It's not about just agreeing to what was said blindly, but it's just a step that's important and vital so that you can lay the foundation for a better conversation. And if you disagree with something, you can have amicable dissent at that point as well. And finally, negotiate. So once you've used the first 3 steps to understand and acknowledge the feedback, you can move on to give your own opinion and suggest solutions to the problem. If you agree with the feedback, this is really when you normally, it's quite easy for you and the person giving the feedback to find a way to address the problem, and you should try to find that if you do agree with it. And if you need time to, you can ask for that. You can walk away and say, hey, this is great. Can I have some time to think about ways to address this and evaluate what I've heard for a day or more? However, if you disagree, you need to be careful that you keep the conversation calm and focused on the issue at hand. This promotes constructive dialogue that's aimed at finding a solution. So avoid a can't-do approach by sounding, in your vocabulary. You want to use can-do wording and phrasing in the vocabulary, so you keep it as a positive way of disagreement, and carefully framing your replies as to what you're able and willing to do. So, yeah, so get in the practice of evaluating feedback, sort through what you've heard, and ask yourself some questions. So what you can do is ask yourself, does a criticism seem true? Have you had a suspicion about it yourself? Right. Number 2, does the giver have credibility to make the observation? Are they in a position where they could do it? 3, is the source valid? Do you trust it? If not, does that mean the input is wrong? It could still be right. 4, have others said similar things? And 5, look for opportunities to improve on the performance of the action based on the feedback. And of course, through this all, don't forget at the end to thank the person giving the feedback. Because similarly to positive feedback, they went out of their way to come to you to give you something that will help you in your personal growth. So give them sincere thanks for coming out of their way for that. Okay, so sometimes we have to acknowledge that not everyone has effective feedback delivery skills. So, for example, maybe you get feedback in public, and that's not considered good practice. Firstly, never argue. Second, just say thanks, even if you think the feedback is wrong or not justified. Showing your appreciation of the feedback will help you to form a better bond and an interaction with the person who cares enough to give you those insights. And so going back to your bhajan example, so imagine you are now the same bhajan singer as before, and you want to introduce a new bhajan that you just heard and you really love, and you want to introduce that to your center. And you practice all week, and when it comes to lead, it's your turn and you lead it. But when after Arati comes, and you're standing there with the crowd around you, an adult devotee comes straight up to you with people all around you and says, hey, you shouldn't have chosen that song because it's too hard to follow and no one knows it. And everyone around you hears and you feel embarrassed. You got this feedback and you feel embarrassed. Maybe it wasn't the best way to give it, but it's a position out of your growth. Now, so imagine applying everything we talked about in such a scenario and seeing if it would help the dialogue. So in interest of time, we'll keep going, but something to think about. So using feedback. Ultimately, it's a tool for our personal growth. Claim it and work it. If you decide that the feedback you get is legitimate, then commit to making changes. Embrace that you can learn and improve. Next up, change your concept of success. Come up with an improvement that answers the feedback and apply it so you can improve whatever it is, that skill or performance, whatever. Then use the feedback to better understand how others view you or your position in the team or whatever that environment is, and engage in a dialogue that allows you to get a better sense of the expectations that whoever it is has or whatever the team has and what the possibilities of futures are. And hey, find a mentor. Think of it as a good way to develop and grow with your interactions with others that have walked a path, which is in many ways the concept of a guru, one who can take away the darkness and give you the light. And you know what? When you also find a mentor and you're able to take the feedback and grow as a result, that's also a reflection on their ability as a mentor. So that's great. You both get to grow. And remember, this is something that applies to all aspects of our lives. It's also our spiritual aspects when it comes to our spiritual growth as well. So a question for you, real scenario time. We're wrapping up on the receiving feedback. We're going to go into the giving feedback. Before we do, here's a scenario, and really quickly, let's think about what you might do and share your answers in the bottom right-hand corner. So you're in charge of the devotional offering at the next World Youth Festival, and you're in Prashanthi Nilayam. There's 3 days till the offering is on, and you know what? You got sick. So for the last 3 days of rehearsals, you're leading the devotional offering, but you just stayed in your room. You didn't tell anyone why, because you figured the practice is going well. It's a strong team, and they just run smoothly without you. So no one has heard about you for 3 years, but you believe in your team. And it's 3 days to go till the offering. So now you're better, and you attend the next practice session, and the YA leader pulls you aside and privately and tells you that, hey, you know, we didn't know where you were, the team was down, because no one knew where you were, rehearsal instruction, no one was in charge, and they said, you know, you should to give you some feedback on how we should have handled this, and you talk about it. What would you do? Actually, at this scenario, before going further, what would you do based on what you know now? Okay, so Darshana says, 1, acknowledge and say thank you for reaching out personally. Very good. Donovan shares, Amita was wrong for not informing anyone of my illness. Very nice. Nitya shares, reflect on whether this was true. Kartika says, acknowledge. Minakshi says, acknowledge and admit mistakes. Kartika says, acknowledge and take necessary action. Irina says, thanking, apologizing, and accepting the feedback. Umesh says, acknowledge and ensure that a meeting will be called to increase the morale of the team. Raksha says, when you perceive the intention of the person to give feedback is pure, it is easier to receive feedback and cultivate humility. Swari said, 1, acknowledge and thank the person giving feedback. 2, acknowledge my failure to appoint an assistant to cover my absence. 3, work on improving the offering the next 2 days. Very good. So these are all great answers, and it's really great that you also got we've seen a third point, which is talking with the person who raised it, if you're acknowledging it, and coming up with a plan for the future. So it's great that we're also learning that lesson as well. Learning and reflecting on mistakes. Learning and reflecting on mistakes helps you be a better person to apologize for your absence. Yeah. So great. And so I think these lessons are coming together very nicely, and by the responses. So now that you've mastered the art of receiving feedback and have thought through the perspective of being that person getting it, you're now ready to learn about how you can give feedback. So we again start with a beautiful quote from our dearest Lord, reminding us that before you speak, ask yourself, is it kind? Is it necessary? Is it true? Does it improve on silence? So the question might arise in your mind now, how does the giving of feedback that may be corrective in nature fit into this teaching from Swami? Well, firstly, know that it all depends on the place that the feedback comes from. If it is true and the motivation is out of a genuine desire for the individual's growth, if it's from a place of love and with no malice or ill intent behind it, then if you look at it, it will still pass the first three of these tests. So you just have to ask yourself, does it improve on the silence? And on that, if you are in a position of authority, remember it is in fact your duty to provide feedback to those who you direct, so they can in turn learn and grow on their paths. They are in fact under your wing, in your care. They'll only grow to that feedback. So even though at first sight you might think, wow, how does these reconcile? When you dig deeper, you can see that it doesn't only reconcile. In situations, it's actually a duty as long as it's coming from the right place and it's the right method that you're using, which we'll talk about. Okay, so as mentioned, as leaders of today, leaders of tomorrow, it is our responsibility to give feedback to the people that we lead. But feedback doesn't have to come from the top down. You might have to give feedback to your boss, your peers, your reports, given the circumstance. So why should you give feedback? Let's start with that. First of all, it creates a supportive, communicative, and successful environment for the team. When you give feedback on people's strengths, weaknesses, concerns, they feel supported. People grow when they're accustomed to receiving feedback, and really fosters a culture of cooperation and communication where we can solve problems together. And it helps individuals to meet whatever goals that they have or the team has and meet expectations others have. So all in all, when we get that culture of regular feedback in the right way, it actually creates a supportive environment. Next, it motivates people. Feedback can maintain and actually create a high standard of commitment with the team and the people you're with. It'll make people feel proud of their work because they're taking it to another level. And they'll make an even higher investment in doing a good job as a result. It'll develop people's skills. It'll foster growth. It in turn motivates people. It helps people feel valued and gets them inspired. Next one, it maintains and improves performance. People know when they're on track, so they continue to march towards goals and expectations. It corrects errors. It'll correct drops in performance. The standards are high. You know, Swami did this a lot. He'd correct people to make sure that the standards are high. And he'd also give them feedback to improve their targets, their standards when they're at a high level. It lets recipients know how to perceive them and their work. So this helps them put it into a context, a human context. They learn how people perceive their accomplishments, and they get insights as a result, and give them more objective understanding of strengths and weaknesses. So giving feedback is ultimately about letting people know how well they're doing at meeting their goals and the expectations of others. As we talked about, it creates a supportive, communicative, successful environment, and it motivates the recipients to really do better. It maintains and improves their abilities, and lets recipients know how others perceive them. And as we remember from Swami's quote from a couple of slides ago, remember that this must all come from a place of love. Be mindful of your delivery, and remember that feedback shouldn't come across as being delivered in an angry way or any sort of negative way, because that won't come across supportive. So here's a three-step structure to actually getting a feedback session up and running. First of all, make sure that it's you that has observed the individual's behavior directly, so either positive or corrective, because you want to be the one that saw it and can say, yes, it happened. You shouldn't do it in a way that's hovering around, but you should be there and notice it. Question to ask yourself in this point is, hey, did you observe the behavior directly before you start a feedback session? Did you suspend judgment before observing? And are you tending to search for mistakes, or is it just something that you've been able to observe? Number two, prepare. Make sure you plan when and where to give the feedback. Always make sure that you can give feedback in person rather than to an intermediary. If not in person, at least it's you through some media, whether it's video, phone, etc. And try to give it as soon as possible. Typically, that applies to both corrective and positive feedback. It's better to actually tend to give it in a private setting if it is, in fact, a individual type of feedback versus a group feedback. But if you're giving feedback in a group setting, such as a classroom, so we've got some teachers here I know, just be sensitive. Don't single anyone out, and give it with the intention of helping everyone learn if the feedback is supposed to be for the entire group and not just an individual. So this step questions to ask yourself. Did you, when you gave the feedback, did you choose a private place? Are you the one that's going to give it? Are you giving it the feedback soon after observing the behavior? Because otherwise it may no longer be relevant. It may not matter anymore. And if you are giving the feedback in a meeting or a workshop and it's for the group, make sure you don't single anyone out. It's for everyone to learn together. And that's positive and corrective. Now, giving feedback effectively. Starting with positive feedback, this should be specific, it should be congratulatory, and it should outline the impact of the behavior and how this behavior can be maintained or even improved in the future. So you can even set a new goal for this person at this point. Corrective, well, this should be given so that it starts with a positive, then moves to a corrective criticism, and then ends on a positive note with a view for the future. So it's kind of what you might call that sandwich type of technique. So begin by acknowledging positive qualities about the person, then go into the corrective, but then look to the future saying, I know that if you do X, Y, Z, I can see you overcoming this and look forward to you delivering in the future, etc. But when you're talking about the, so like we said, you begin with congratulatory positive feedback, but When you specify that behavior that needs correcting, do it in a supportive way and explain the impact of the behavior. So speak to the behavior, not the person. And it's best if there's a dialogue rather than you telling them what's wrong and why they're getting it wrong. And then finally, as we talked about, end with some positive, supportive feedback, suggesting ways to improve. Make sure you help them find a way to improve. It's not just telling them what's wrong, but you work with them and look for the future. It's not just finding fault, but it's helping to find solutions so they feel positive and supported and confident about what to do. Okay, so once you've observed the behavior yourself and have come prepared, and you've observed the behavior, now you're ready to prepare how to give the feedback. So here's an internal checklist to make sure you've got the right reasons down for giving the feedback. First, check your intentions. You want to make sure it's not about venting or about anything else, but a genuine want to help someone improve and grow. And if your motives are sincere, then you can go ahead to planning the feedback session so it'll be effective. Next up, prepare by making sure you give the feedback in an appropriate private place, if possible. And as much as possible, try to make sure that the person sees the feedback coming rather than taking them by surprise. If possible, it's not always possible, but at least if you can pull them aside and say, hey, I want to talk to you about something important, about feedback, etc. Or even if it's a meeting invite, you're at work, that says performance, that can be helpful so they're not blindsided to see it coming. Make sure you have supporting information with you, so that's part of the observing first. It could be consulting with people, if it's printouts, documentation, anything, but so it's a solid case and you're not speaking the generics. And make sure that the feedback is relevant, relate it to their larger goals and make it constructive to help them get to the larger goals. So this also applies in the spiritual sense. We're all here to become better spiritual beings, to ultimately realize who we are, go back to the source. So on a spiritual path, getting the feedback and giving someone feedback should be applied to that larger goal. And finally, make sure that you're creating a summary about the feedback you're about to give and be clear about what you'd like the recipient to correct and what you'd like them to keep on doing. So here's a checklist as you prepare to give the feedback to go through mentally. And when it comes to giving the feedback, first of all, find the right time to give the feedback. If you can, do it in the spot, pull them somewhere private, as close as possible, as close to the time as possible as it happened. But of course, the more sensitive feedback, make sure you wait and deliver it. You have to make sure it's for the right time and the right reasons, of course. And the right time, of course, could also be based on if it's positive or corrective. But in general, it's best to give corrective feedback on the spot if it's appropriate and you're able to, because if it's too far away from the event, it's no longer relevant, it may lose value. For more sensitive feedback, it's actually better to wait and deliver. You may also need your own time for more sensitive feedback to process your own emotional reactions, to assess the situation, gather your thoughts. So instead of rushing in, you can, in fact, those times take your time to prepare and to have a constructive conversation. For positive feedback, thanking people for a great job, commending them for taking initiative, celebrate when they win. Again, you can give it at the right time, but closer to the event is again better. But aim to make both positive and corrective feedback as close to the time as possible. Except unless it's sensitive, in which case you might want to hold back. So I know we're coming up to close on time, so I'll go to the next part quickly. So again, this is when it comes to giving the feedback. So we've observed, we've planned, now we're giving the feedback. Remember, we've already gone through putting ourselves in the other person's shoes, so keep that in mind. Start your feedback with a positive, like we planned. So you plan to make it a positive, for example, mentioning something about something they've done lately that you really appreciate. Then the middle part, that sandwich, be specific about the behavior you're referring to. Recreate it if necessary, using, you can even quote directly. Be calm and constructive when you're doing this. Keep any emotions under control. Beware of maintaining personal space between you and the recipients, and control all your facial expressions, your tones, your body language. And then, like we talked about in your plan, end it with a positive. Provide a plan of action or suggestions on how the recipients can correct, improve, and prevent behavior in the future. So a scenario here, so imagine that you're a college teaching assistant, or TA as they call it in the States, and you notice there's one student who's constantly checking their phone, doing your labs, not paying attention, and when you're grading them, you're actually starting to see that their grades are falling, and to you it's correlation of the lack of participation in class, and you see this as probably below their potential. So imagine how you could apply this corrective feedback here, where you are the teaching assistant for a student who's just not putting in the effort that they should be and falling behind as a result, and you want them to succeed. So another one, here's a tricky one. What happens if it's not well received? You're given feedback and it's not well received. Well, just remember that not everyone's going to be open to receiving it, so there are ways to handle a situation. First of all, be aware of mirroring. It's actually a natural tendency for us as people to match the tone of the person that we're speaking it. We can match the vocal tone, the body language, etc. This is called mirroring when we match each other. But if the other person's upset, make sure you're consciously not mirroring, that you stay calm so that they in turn will mirror you. And then handle any excuses that may come up respectfully. And what you'll find is most excuses, upon close inspection, they'll actually dissolve if you work through them and work with them. Just as long as you stay calm and you can stay as objective as possible and work through the things. And this will allow you to handle situations where it's not well received. And if you really need to, you can always have the option to walk away. You can excuse yourself from the situation and postpone it for a later time when you're both able to talk. And say you also got upset in some way, you can wait till you're both calm and able to have a constructive talk that's really about solving problems and helping people to grow. So giving feedback, just some checklist items when you're doing it to make sure that it's effective. Make sure it's face-to-face, unless there's no other option, in which case phone, then email. Find a common ground. It should be about we're all in this together. Emphasize your shared experiences in whatever you're working on. Stress how this is something that maybe you've struggled with in the past when you had to do the same thing. Focus on performance and processes. Again, like we talked about, focus on the behavior, action, situation, or issue at hand. It's not about you or the other person. It's about those things. You can use passive voice to shift attention away from the person and more towards the issue. Be specific about the performance or behavior issue, including its impact and how it might be improved. So illustrate clearly what needs to be improved. State exactly what effect it had, how you think the situation may be improved, and what steps can be taken. Comment on actionable issues. Be specific so the recipient can act on your comments. Only comment on what you've actually observed. This is your own feedback. Nothing like I've been getting complaints or someone else is concerned. This is what you've observed. Offer concrete recommendations and ask for recommendations as well. Make it a dialogue. Now this is a step that helps in the growth of the individual. So you can say, this is what we can try to make things better. What do you think we can do to make this better, for example? Engage in a dialogue, not a monologue. Asking questions naturally invites conversation. Be a coach. So again, asking questions is a common coaching technique that helps individuals uncover and discover answers for themselves. Don't overwhelm with too much information at once. And finally, let the recipient know that they're in control. You're there to help, but it's up to them to improve and grow. We'll go to the real-time scenario very quickly if we go towards wrap-up. So again, I'd like to invite you to share your responses in the bottom right-hand corner. So you are a manager in your workplace and you have brought on a new team member due to increased workload. You gave them an important task and a due date with specific instructions which you noticed they didn't write down. They forget to give you the deliverable when the date is up, and when they do give it to you, it's very different to what you asked for. Timelines are tight, which means you now have to scramble the team to fix this. How would you handle the situation? What would you do? Go ahead and share your responses in the bottom right-hand corner. Sabina shares, thank them for getting it done, but point out the differences and how this will affect the team. See if you can work together to put a system in place to help them with instructions in the future. Very good. Great answer. Meenakshi says, to make sure that they have well understood the instructions given to them, to confirm from them if they understood well, so what has to be done, to monitor the work every now and then. Just one more. Okay, so I says, firstly, I will make a note to myself that I failed to follow up with a newbie, which is what a good manager would at first do, and not wait till due date. Then I would call him and speak to him separately about the method of working towards the deadline, and call a team and say that this needs to be prioritized and done by sharing the work. Very nice perspective and very nice approaches to from all the learnings from today. Raksha says, tell the person how this made me feel with honesty and love. Share what consequences this had for the group and see how we can improve this next time. Maybe I too can make sure next time how I can be more supportive along the way. It's very nice. So some shared learnings here as well as a result of this dialogue. So now you've got the tools and you may be asking, what now? To answer that question, I turn to another timely quote from my dearest Lord, where he says, whatever books you may read, you cannot realize the divine merely by intellectual effort. One must put into practice. That sense of oneness can only be promoted by the practice of love and not by any other means. So again, I'm focusing on the concept here of the practice, as Swami says, that learning isn't enough, we must put into practice. And though he was talking about this necessarily more in the spiritual books and putting that into practice, it also applies here that when you're putting what you learned about feedback, the best way to do it is to put it into practice and also do it with love. So we've covered a lot today, but remember that giving and receiving feedback is like any other skill. The more you use it, the better you will get. So start practicing these tips from today. And remember that we give and receive feedback in some form all the time in this day and age. And so, in this spirit, I would like to actually invite you to give your feedback on today's workshop. And this will be done via a feedback form that will be sent out to you, I believe. And so start with that straight away. Give your feedback so we can improve these workshops. What did you like? What do you think could improve? Any other ideas that you might have, we'd love to hear them. So, time permitting, I would open up to questions, but we're actually over time. So, please feel free to reach out to any of us, the organizers, who have any more Q&A, and we will be more than happy to answer those questions. And so now a quick reflection. The pure heart is the best mirror for the reflection of truth. So all these disciplines are for the purification of the heart. As soon as it is pure, all truths flash upon it in a minute. And so a quick reflection as we wrap up. So with that, I'd just like to invite you all to share one lesson, one thought, one idea, anything that really resonated or that you remember that you want to take away from today's workshop, and go ahead and share in the bottom right-hand corner. Shabu says, thank you, brother, great workshop. Quick, quite informative. The point that resonated the most with me was accept positive feedback as a gift rather than downplaying. Yeah. Darshana shares, whatever you do, receiving or giving feedback, use love as a compass and all will be well. Yeah. Sathya says, put yourself in the other person's shoes and aim for their true development while giving feedback. Abina, I really like the bit about accepting positive feedback, how we can feel uncomfortable because we're not sure if it's genuine or oriented. I think this accepting this is something for me to work on. Awesome. Ashni says, oh, that's a great response to flowing in. Thank you. Important to give and receive feedback. I think my chat window is a bit bigger so I can see all your great answers. Here we go. Okay. Donovan says, small question at the time. Okay, we spoke about corrective feedback, mentioned a fight or flight response, but What about the freeze response? Okay, we'll see how we go for time, and then I'll see where you're able to answer that. So that one, if quickly going back, one of the ones that you might have remembered was where we actually go into a lockup mental state. So let me go to some answers and come back. Sri Sai Girida would like to add a point, please. Attitude of being an instrument of God. Positive feedback is good confidence booster, but potentially hamper progress. So it is important for the seeker to offer the positive feedback to Bhagavan. Instruments will be kept clean and well, lubricated with love. Corrective feedback is to be accepted as a cleaning and lubricated agent. Very nice perspective, sure. Yeah, absolutely. Irina says, thank you, dear brother. Very needed skills in every situation. Thanking you. Raksha shares, both giving and receiving feedback leads us to personal growth and great understanding of who we are. Love, honesty, humility, and courage recovered today. Wonderful. Purvanisha says, thank you for another wonderful session. I like to never argue if the feedback is not received well. Anastasia says, it was super informative, really useful how to give feedback, and it's important and allows us to prevent many conflicts. Thank you. Not being a mirror while not doing feedback is so important. So she says, whether we receive feedback or corrective feedback, show love and positivity to our emotions. These are wonderful answers. I'm going to keep reading these because they're coming in, but I know in the interest of time, we're actually running out of time. So again, so if there's any questions that come out, and I know we've got some follow-ups, but I'd be more than happy to take them offline. Okay, so a real quick recap. So today we went through and defined feedback, and we understood why we needed. We saw Swami is the gold standard. We have a formula or a four-step process for receiving corrective feedback. We have our process for receiving positive feedback. We came up with a three-step approach for how we can prepare to give feedback, as well as approaches and checklists to go through when we were in a situation of giving either positive or corrective feedback. And we also had some nice participation from everyone, some great sharing as well. And ultimately, we know that feedback, as long as it comes from love and it's about the person's development, then that is the starting point, and everything else will come around that as long as we come from that right place. The other skills we can practice around it. So again, thanks everyone for joining. I'm more than happy to take questions offline, and there's a couple that came through, and I'm really very grateful for this opportunity. And now this is my turn to give you guys feedback. I have to say, you guys were amazing. Throughout the program, I just saw how coming in, everyone is very enthusiastic, and I saw how you were all participating and paying attention and sharing answers, and it was really informative and constructive, and it was very much the situation where I think we all learned, and I just want to say thank you for that. It was wonderful to have you guys part of this workshop, and I look forward to you taking these tools and growing from this in the future and letting me know how it goes. So with that, thank you again for letting me be part of this program. I would like to thank the Young Adult Talent Development Program team for giving me this opportunity and being such inspiring guides in helping to structure this installment. I would like to thank all the SSIO leadership for allowing these programs to come together and supporting the YA program. And of course, to our dearest Swami, for it is you who is ultimately behind everything we do. You, Swami, are the source, the path, and the goal. So dear brothers and sisters, wherever you are in the world, a very good morning, a good afternoon, a good evening, or a good night to you all. Jai Sai Ram, I will hand back to the Young Adult Talent Development Program team to close out. Thank you. Sai Ram.
Thank you so much, Brother Satheeshan, for sharing with us the art of effectively giving and receiving feedback, and most importantly, how to put it into practice. I'm sure all of us have learned something from this wonderful session. We will now have a chance to complete the feedback session form, which will be in the link in the chat box, to reflect about what we have learned and what you would like to see in the future. Please list your names so that we can verify your attendance. You can submit one entry if you viewed as a group, but please ensure that all names of those who are in attendance are on that list. An exciting new development we are introducing for 2018 is that if you attend 5 or more workshops in 2018, you'll be eligible for a bonus experience. Stay tuned to find out more. We appreciate the time and hope we can continue to improve our workshop based on your feedback. Thank you once again, Brother Satheeshan. Our next workshop will take place on April 21st with Sister Roshni Viswanathan, called Facilitation Skills, Guiding Groups to Growth. Sister Roshni is the current Deputy International Young Adult Coordinator and has a lot of experience conducting and running facilitated sessions. Further details of the workshop will be released soon. We recommend that you have not already liked the SAI Young Adults page on Facebook or Instagram to be notified of the workshop details. We once again thank Brother Satheeshan and every one of you that attended. Let's close today's session with Shanti Path. Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Jai Sai Ram, everyone.